Thanks, Haley. All right, hello, and thanks to all of you for coming to PDW number 7, editing your proposal part 2. I would like to apologize in advance. I caught a cold over the weekend, so my voice is a little hoarse. My name is Daniel Freud, and I'm a senior program manager in the Office of Research, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship in the Fulton Schools of Engineering. Last time in editing your proposal part 1, Knowledge Enterprise editor Terry Christensen discussed logic and clarity in proposal editing. Today, we're going to discuss sentence and paragraph structure, as well as some issues with style, grammar, and usage. I'll also offer some strategies for taking a closer look at your own writing. So here's the agenda. I'll start by discussing editing on a slightly more abstract level. Then I'll provide some tips for self-editing, and then we'll go into elements of style and grammar and usage. All right, so as I said, before getting into the nuts and bolts of editing, I'd like to talk about editing on a more abstract level. In my view, editing is a key part of the proposal development process, and my favorite and most successful experiences working with faculty tend to be when I get the chance to discuss the project with them early on and work on multiple drafts. So I'm really part of the team rather than stepping in at the last moment. Editing is a crucial step between drafting a proposal and submitting it. Whether you seek out a professional editor or want to learn how to give your own work a more careful polish, everybody can benefit from editing, no matter their experience or skill level. My goal today is to provide you with some things to think about and strategies to use when you approach editing your own work. The purpose of editing, as I wrote here, is to help you communicate your ideas as clearly as possible. And it's important to recognize the difference between information and communication. On this next slide, I'm quoting from an excellent article, George Gopin and Judith Swan's The Science of Scientific Writing. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend doing so, no matter your academic discipline. It discusses some common issues with scientific writing and how to avoid them. It uses valuable research-based advice on how readers encounter and process information, and they provide tips for strategically editing your work to facilitate that act of processing. And as they say, that's the quote here, the fundamental purpose of scientific discourse is not the mere presentation of information and thought, but rather its actual communication. So when writing a proposal or article or any other kind of academic writing, your goal is not merely to represent your ideas, it's to communicate them so that readers not only understand them accurately, but feel some kind of investment or interest in those ideas. So I like to think of the presentation of information as sort of like screwing off the top of your head and letting your ideas dump out, right? That's kind of how the drafting process works. But then you need to do something beyond that so that you don't have a messy first draft that does not succeed in persuading your readers. And I think that this point is especially true of proposals because you're trying to persuade your readers that your work and ideas merit funding, and you're often doing so in a very limited space. So editing can really help you to get your points across clearly. And editing is not just about identifying and correcting issues of grammar, mechanics, and style, but about improving the overall clarity of the writer's work and ensuring that the document achieves its purpose. Oops. I accidentally clicked a link. Sorry about that. All right, so first, editing your own work. Um, I'd like to discuss a few strategies you can use to edit your own work. First, I'd like to reiterate that it's always a great idea to take advantage of professional editing. Of course, I am biased, but trained editors know how to handle a document respectfully and skillfully, preserving the writer's ideas and intentions while sharpening the prose and eliminating errors. They're also less attached to the document in question. One reason why it's hard to edit your own work is that you're too familiar with it, and I myself will gladly own up to that. When it comes to my writing, I absolutely need editors because when I look at my own work, I just don't see the same things that an outside party does. I kind of fill in the gaps on my own because it's too familiar to me. And I think the same is true for pretty much everybody. But all that said, sometimes you want or need to edit your own work for a variety of reasons. Perhaps you lack the time or funds, or you simply want to develop that skill. So let's talk about how to do it responsibly. My first tip is to use software with caution. Services like Grammarly and even Microsoft Word's built-in editor have a purpose, but they should be used carefully. They're widely available and frequently used, and they aren't going anywhere, and actually professional editors often make use of them as well. They can help you catch some things, grammar mistakes such as subject-verb agreement, inconsistent verb tenses, usage issues, for instance, using slang or informal language. However, they're better at locating errors than editing for style. They often detect where a problem occurs or a possible problem, but they're not so good at finding a useful solution. And this is especially true when it comes to more specialized content, such as grant proposal writing. Proposals require a specialized writing style and they have a specific purpose. So these services cannot provide structural editing and lack an understanding of context. And really, it just makes sense because both Grammarly and Word are built for a range of users, all possible users, right? Who are using language to communicate, so that they just don't understand the purpose of a proposal. So I'm going to give you a couple of very simple examples. I ran an earlier draft of this presentation with some quotations from the Gopin and Swan article through Word's editor. It flagged the following phrase, which you can see here. Imagine that an investigator tracks the temperature of a liquid over a period of time. So it flagged this for conciseness, not necessarily an error, and it wants me to change a period of time to a period. That is not correct. If I were to shorten the phrase, I would drop the other part so that it reads tracks the temperature of a liquid over time. Again, simple example, but it shows you the sort of lack of context or lack of useful suggestions that you sometimes run into. And here's another quick one from a proposal I edited recently. It's discussing sensors, and then it says eliminate certain redundant sensors that generate nearly identical images. And Word wants me to change nearly identical to identical. And that's not quite the same thing. So the danger here is that you just kind of click very quickly through the suggestions and accept all of them, you might introduce errors into your proposal. So in both cases, Word's editor has found a problem area, but it doesn't know how to fix it. And Grammarly works much the same way. So this is why you still need a set of human eyes in your work. If you use these services, make sure to carefully scrutinize the passages they flag, but don't just click through and accept every suggestion. Think about whether they're logical or make sense when spoken aloud. You may be better off thinking of your own. All right, so my second tip is to make use of resources online that can help refine your understanding of grammar and usage. There are a lot of books on these subjects as well, but today I'm just going to stick to some free online resources. First, Grammarly.com is actually very useful. It has an online guide to grammar and punctuation. And the second and third ones, this might sound really basic, but dictionary websites are so useful for when you need to look for examples of usage, or if you need to do things like check which prepositions to use when, like suitable to versus suitable for, right? I constantly use dictionaries just to make sure that I'm using words correctly when I make suggestions and proposals. Merriam-Webster is my favorite, but Collins is also really good. Third tip, get some distance. As I said earlier, it's hard to edit your own work because it's too familiar. Thus, it's best to approach editing your own writing with as fresh an eye as possible. Give yourself time. For instance, if you can take a whole weekend to put your writing away and avoid looking at it entirely, read other things, watch TV, try to get some distance from that writing. Or you can try other strategies to defamiliarize your work. You can try reading problematic passages out loud, for example. Sometimes hearing sentences verbally can alert you to lengthy sentences, awkward phrasing, or poor organization. Fourth tip, get a buddy. Many proposals have multiple authors, which can be handy for a round of switching sections and editing each other's contributions. Whether or not that's the case for you, it can be helpful and rewarding to share writing with a friend or colleague, in addition to employing a professional editor. The good thing about working with someone over time is that they and you will begin to notice your quirks and you can learn to self-correct. So in a sense, I'm actually advocating for having a writing group. So for a personal example, when I was in grad school writing my dissertation, I had a writing group with a stable group of friends for a couple of years. And my friends came to know that my number one issue as a writer was creating enormous paragraphs, which were sometimes 2 pages long or more, which means that I left my readers with huge blocks of dense text. So again, like I said earlier, I was kind of screwing the top of my head off and letting my ideas spill out, right? And that does a poor job of communicating my ideas. It's just sort of spilling them out for the reader to sift through. But because I repeatedly shared my writing with them, they noticed that I kept doing this, and so did I. So I gradually became more aware of this issue and tried to avoid doing it on my own. All right, so now let's transition to discussing some elements of good style. My tips about style are intended to help you take a closer look at your own writing so that you can more clearly express your ideas and persuade your readers. I showed this information earlier, so I would just like to reiterate the purpose of editing to help you communicate your ideas as clearly as possible. And again, consider that difference between information and communication. One of the keys to good style and to editing is a fairly simple point, which is to understand your reader's expectations and play into them rather than resist them. Essentially, it means making your reader work less hard to understand what you're trying to say. So let's talk about sentence and paragraph structure in order to do that. I like to think of each section, paragraph, and even sentence as a little unit or building block within the larger structure of your proposal, and every single one should be doing work for you. I already mentioned that I'm often guilty of writing mega paragraphs that take up an entire page or two, and I've seen them plenty of times as an editor as well. These are not only unpleasant to read, but poorly structured. Um, because again, they reflect the way that I think. I, for one, tend to think and write myself into my ideas, figuring out what I want to say only at the end of a writing session. But paragraphs like this present my thinking, right? They don't communicate my ideas. It's important to take a step back and look for the topic sentence, which might be buried somewhere toward the end of the paragraph, or even somewhere in the middle. Um, so again, proposal should communicate your ideas rather than reflect your thoughts. And in both a sentence and a paragraph, readers expect the beginning of them to establish the topic. Well-organized paragraphs with clear topic sentences are especially important in proposals because they assist your reader in navigating the document. When readers are getting through these materials quickly, they don't want to wade through pages of material. They just want to look to the beginning of the paragraph to kind of get the point quickly, especially if they're going back and rereading something, as it says here. And then the end of the sentence or paragraph is a great place to put new information you want to stick in your readers' heads. All right, so I want to show a brief example. I edited a paragraph from an NSF blog post about broader impacts. Take a moment to read it and see what you think. This paragraph starts with a sentence about the relationship between society and research, and then it gives a couple of examples. It's not until the end that we understand what the paragraph is supposed to be about. Broader impacts in terms of research proposals. That first sentence isn't a terrible topic sentence, but it doesn't really capture the connection to proposals. A paragraph structured in this way suppresses the main point, confusing readers and potentially requiring them to scan the information twice. So let's take a look at the same paragraph again, noticing that the sentences are now in a different and I think more logical order. So now you have the following as the topic sentence. The broader impact statement is a critical component of any research proposal submitted to NSF. Then you get a description of broader impacts, some examples, and then reinforcement of the point. Understanding how to impact society research is important for building trust with the communities we serve. So it makes a slightly different point at the end, right? The point about communities, but it also reinforces the main idea. I see this kind of thing all the time in the proposals I edit in the full schools of engineering, but I think it happens to all of us no matter the discipline. It's a common problem that is simply a result of not revising once you nail down your ideas. So now to move on to sentences, think of each topic sentence as a kind of mini argument establishing the claims you make within the paragraph. And what I've just said about paragraphs also applies to sentences. As readers of English, we typically expect the subject and the verb to be close together and toward the beginning of the sentence. So for some very simple examples, I go to the store, I edit the proposal, she talks to me, and so on. And while the sentences in proposals tend to be a little bit more complex, the same point still holds. I often encounter sentences that vary the verb after a lengthy clause, which makes it harder to get through the sentence. And often sentences that have issues with subject-verb separation need to be split into two or more. So take a look at this example, which actually comes from the Gopin and Swan article. This is all just one sentence, and it's complicated because it has a lot of jargon, right? But we also have the subject, the smallest of the URFs, the entire phrase is the subject, up here, and the main verb in the sentence doesn't appear until the third line here. So you get a ton of information here, but it's not until here that you get what the writer is trying to say about the topic. The simplest solution to this example would be simply to remove everything between the subject and the verb and place it in a new sentence. Oops, sorry. So here, the smallest of the URFs is, and then we get all that descriptive information that was already there, period. It has been identified as, etc. So fairly simple fix, but it does make the information much easier to grasp. And then here's a second example from a proposal I worked on fairly recently. So we get all this information about US senior citizens over 65. And it's not until here that we get the topic, approximately 15% of those senior citizens. And it's true that the verb is right next to it, but still this information doesn't appear until quite a ways into the sentence. So it's really easy to revise the sentences like this. So you retain this first phrase, and then a majority had debilitating illnesses. So it's just making a simple change here. And then approximately 15% of these were attributed to blah, blah, blah. So in this case, we made almost no changes to the prose, but it does make it a little bit easier to read. All right, so now I'd like to discuss a few common issues in grammar and usage. Oops, sorry, scrolled ahead too fast. Something I'm asked to do a lot when I edit proposals is to reduce their wordiness, given that proposals tend to have strict requirements for document length. These tips will help you to improve the clarity of your prose, but they may also save you a precious few lines of text. So first, passive voice. Passive voice is extremely common in academic writing, especially in STEM fields. I think writers often feel concerned about using I. However, I'm always encouraging the people I work with to use active voice instead. Direct language is clearer, easier to read, and more elegant. The issue with passive voice is that it obscures meaning, who or what is doing something. Sometimes that ambiguity is unavoidable or even preferable. And a good example would be to think of a news report on a crime. The house on 3rd Street was broken into last night. So the passive voice is was broken into, right? We may not know who committed the crime. The important details are that a house was broken into, right? So you don't really need to know who did it at that point. But in proposals, it's usually best to avoid such indirect language. Again, one of the goals of effective proposal writing and editing is to avoid making your readers work hard. Passive voice often asks readers to fill in details or gaps. It also simply takes up more room on the page, so if space is at a premium, it needs to go. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. You can spot passive voice whenever you see a form of to be plus a participle. Is given, was earned, were analyzed. And I have a couple of examples here. Distance education will be considered for all certifications. This sentence does not indicate who will be considering distance education, right? So you can fairly easily change it by writing our team or whoever it happens to be. Sorry, our team will consider distance education for all certifications. And then emphasis will be given to developing a prototype. It's much better to revise and say something more specific, such as this. The first phase of our research will emphasize developing a prototype. And then this is just one more example from In the Wild, a proposal I edited a couple of weeks ago. The subject of the sentence isn't always going to be we or our team or our research. In this case, I revised it so that it says In stage one, electrons, that's the subject, located close to the Fermi surface, absorb the pulsed laser energy. It just streamlines the sentence. It makes it more easier to read. All right, nominalization and adjectivization. These are what happens when you turn a verb into a noun or adjective. These are not technically errors. However, both of them tend to make your prose wordier and clunkier. So look for examples of adjectives that end in IVE and nouns that end in TION, although that's not foolproof. Here are some examples. This method is reflective of previous research. So this is an adjectivization of the verb reflect. And you can very easily reword this. This method reflects previous research. Same thing goes for these other examples. We will obtain measurements of, we will perform evaluations of. Instead, you can say, we will measure, we will evaluate. And then here, this is the same sentence from the preceding slide. The first phase of our research will emphasize developing a prototype. So instead of using emphasis, the noun, you can use the verb emphasize here. All right, verb tense and verb constructions. First, it's a fairly simple point. The present progressive, I see this quite a lot in proposals. That's whenever you see is or are plus a gerund, an ing verb. It can almost always be replaced by the simple present. In this case, the PI is currently leading a project on XYZ. You can just say the PI currently leads a project on XYZ. Second one, dangling modifiers. This one, dangling modifiers are kind of the bane in my existence as an editor. They drive me nuts. They're common in everyday speech. You will often hear them in constructions like the following. As an editor, dangling modifiers annoy me. So this is dangling because this phrase as an editor doesn't apply to the subject of the sentence. There should be a subject here that is modified by this phrase. So here's the corrected version. As an editor, I find dangling modifiers annoying. So you can see in this example, this sentence actually has two errors. It uses the passive voice, right? Were modified, and it also has a dangling modifier. So here's the revised version. After completing the initial study, we modified our research goals. So now you're specifying who completed the initial study, and you're also getting rid of that passive voice. Oops, sorry, my mouse is a little wonky. All right, next, possessives. An easy way to save space in your document is simply to revise your possessives. The primary goal of our project is to versus our project's primary goal is to. And finally, general wordiness. Gaining an awareness of general wordiness takes time and skill as a writer, but I do think there are a few things you can watch out for. Keep an eye out for redundant adjectives or whole phrases, as well as wordy sentence constructions that using active voice could streamline. All of the examples in this table come from actual proposals I've edited. So here, sorry, dynamic and ever-changing nature. Ever-changing means essentially the same thing, right? So you can just write dynamic nature or potential pitfalls that might be encountered. This phrase that might be encountered, that's sort of implicit in describing potential pitfalls. So you can just cross the whole thing out, say potential pitfalls. This next one, a method to determine whether these patterns maintain their native properties will be determined. That's kind of clunky, right? It repeats the verb determine twice, and it can be fairly easily revised this way. We will develop a method to determine whether these patterns maintain their native properties. Again, it takes time to develop an ear for wordiness, but I think all of these examples are pretty obvious of just words you don't need, sentences that could be streamlined. Oh my gosh, I'm really sorry about my mouse. It's annoying. Finally, I just wanted to show a few additional cases of wordiness and some of the ways that I've revised those sentences. In this one, the writer is referring to partnerships with fishing communities. This is, of course, from another proposal. Through these projects, the PI, whose name I blacked out, has established strong partnerships with commercial fishing communities and built an expert pool with key stakeholders. And then a lot of this information is repeated in the next sentence, right? So I just revised it. These researchers and connections will be a vital part of this work. It's just repeating phrases that don't need to be there. And then in this one, I did quite a bit of work to this sentence. I'll just read the revised version. A laser induces a shock wave that propagates from the foil's front surface to the rear, causing the latter to accelerate. We'll record the rear surface's velocity, etc. So I did a lot of things here. I got rid of some passive voice. I revised some possessives. I eliminated some redundancy. Again, it can take time to develop an eye for these things, but I think that the version I produced is a little bit more streamlined and easier to read. All right, and this is the end of the information I'd like to share, but I would be more than happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I know Daniel's content, it's very specific to your editing, so you might have to have your question from your writings in front of you, but we also are happy to answer questions via email, researchdevelopment@asu.edu. We have a team of editors here that are not Daniel. Daniel works in Fulton Schools of Engineering. Daniel, did you put your contact information out there for those in Fulton?
No, I didn't, but I can give it to you to share after the presentation.
Yeah, we'll send that out in an email. But for those of you who are not in Fulton Schools of Engineering, we have a team of research editors here in research development that are happy to consult with you and answer any questions. So researchdevelopment@asu.edu. And we are just so glad you joined us today. Thank you for your time, Daniel. Again, appreciate it. And we'll see everyone again for our next PDW, which is after Thanksgiving on December 10th. Yes, that's with our own graphic designer, art director Vince Ulrich for proposal graphics, a little bit of planning and navigating for your proposal graphic success, and some tips and tricks there to manage your own graphics and how to make things look as best they can. So,
and I actually just saw a question in the chat from someone.
Great.
The question is, in a proposal, is it acceptable to use we? Previously, we were advised to avoid using subjects, which might explain why passive voice is so commonly used. Yeah, I've heard that from a lot of people that they were told not to use subjects in their sentences. So I think you're right, Li Hong. That's why passive voice comes up everywhere. But I think it's perfectly acceptable, and I think it's preferable to refer to we or our research team or our group or whatever. Because it's specifying who's doing the action. I always kind of think of the repeated use of passive voice when describing research as making it sound like the research is kind of happening in a void, right? Like no one's actually doing anything. It's kind of happening by itself. I think it's much better to say we are doing this or we will do this. And again, it also takes up less space on the page. So if you don't have a lot of space, you can save some by using active voice instead. Oh yeah, and Adela makes a good point too. I use we, and when possible, I mentioned the researcher doing the research. That's a great point. If you know the specific researcher or researchers who will be doing something, then you should just name them, right? Often proposals have a very large team, and if it's going to be 2 or 3 specific people doing some aspect of the research, just name them. All right, well, thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yes. I'll wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving holiday weekend, and we'll see you on the next proposal development workshop. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Yep, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks so much.